for our weekly virtual author series, which we have been doing now since early April, mostly on Monday nights and Thursday nights, and trying to give you some sense of a schedule, something to look forward to, something to have an actual date on your calendar that you can count on. We've actually been doing, and sometimes 3 a week, but definitely trying to bring you at least 2 chats a week with all kinds of different authors. We have a ton coming up. To be kind of open and pragmatic with you, I would say we're not going to be doing any in-person events probably until well into 2021, if we're being honest with ourselves. But we're going to continue to bring you all this great virtual content and keep up the pace that we've been doing. So we have a lot of great stuff still this year, pretty wide variety. We have everything from Matthew McConaughey to Layla Lalami in conversation with Roxane Gay, and everything in between there. So that's a nice variety for you, because we want it to be kind of a mixtape. We want it to be a little bit of up, a little bit of down, kind of a pace change, have some of that tonal shift, something that's fun that you can just forget about your problems for a little while. And sometimes we want to face those problems head on and talk about things that are happening in the world and our community. So thank you for following along. You can follow Magic City Books on social media to find out more, or go to our website, magiccitybooks.com. So thrilled to always get a chance to talk about books. It's one of the things that's been missing from my life a little bit over these past 6 months, because it's something, being in this world, that I do or did every day of my life. And, you know, being part of the community and kind of people thinking of you as kind of a book person in your community. Everyone wants to ask you what you're reading and talk about books with you, and whether you're at the grocery store or wherever you might be. And I've kind of missed that interaction. It happens from time to time, but I certainly am not getting that as much as I used to. So this will be a nice, little bit of a fix for what I've been missing. So if you don't know the work of the great Nancy Pearl, Nancy, of course, a longtime Tulsan and kind of, I think, in our Mount Rushmore of literary figures here in town. And you still get a chance to hear Nancy's voice and her perspective on KWGS, our local public radio station here. So it's always a thrill to hear Rich Fisher and Nancy talking about books still. I always really get a kick out of that. And we've done events with Nancy before, but this is a really special opportunity because Nancy has joined forces. It's a dynamic duo we have with us tonight with Jeff Schwager. And Jeff is, much like Nancy, it would be difficult to go through the full list. They both do so many things. One of the things that I'm so impressed with is that, we're going to be talking about writers a lot. Jeff is a playwright, an editor, a writer. He took a book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, a book that for many years has seemed daunting to filmmakers and has been talked about and never done. He adapted it to the stage for I believe 5-hour-long play.
That's right.
That in itself is a pretty amazing feat, but they both have done so much great work. And tonight, much like always, we're gonna be talking about writers and books and why writers love the things they love. And there's this wonderful new book they've worked on that's just out called The Writer's Library. So we're gonna dive into that. We're gonna take your questions, so please put those in here. We are going to be selling the book, so make sure if you go into the chat, you can buy that directly from us. All the money goes back to Magic City Books. As you know, Magic City Books is a nonprofit bookstore, so every dollar you spend with us goes right back into the programming and stuff that we do every day. So keep an eye on the chat. Welcome, Nancy. Welcome, Jeff. And thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having us.
I was telling Nancy before, this is going to have an episode of Between Two Jeffs. So if she said Jeff, we're just going to have to figure it out. But thank you both. I'd like to begin, and I will throw this out to whomever wants to take this, which is, I've often thought about, the book that made me really think about this, of course, was not the film, but the book of Nick Hornby's High Fidelity, right? Which was one of the early books about fandom and about obsession and a lot of those things. And there's a line that I'm paraphrasing in there that basically says, it's not what you are like that defines you, it's what you like that defines you. And that's very much kind of what you're getting at the heart of this book. Talk about some of maybe the thesis that you kind of went after when going into this project.
Jeff, do you want to take that?
Sure. Well, I think that sums up very well what our thesis was, that we would learn a lot about these people and as ultimately as writers by learning what it was that they liked both as young people and what they continue to like as adults. So yeah, I mean, that was really our goal, to find out who, the books that made them the people and the writers that they are.
And I recently read that Osip Mandelstam, the great Russian poet, said, if you want to know my biography, look at what I've read. And I think that if only I had read that before we started this project, it would have been interesting to throw that into some of the conversations that we had, because I think that in many ways that's exactly the case. And in some ways, maybe some of the authors that we interviewed, that wasn't necessarily. You couldn't see from what they read as children the kind of books that they would be interested in or write as adults.
So when did the idea for this come about? Nancy, you have so many projects going. Jeff, you have so many projects going. I'm sure it's, maybe life has slowed down a little bit right now, but up till the time of this getting put together, you were having a million different things going on. And there was travel involved and all kinds of different things. This was not an email book. This was an actual sit down in living rooms kind of book. So how did it get started, and how did you two end up joining forces?
Well, it was all Jeff's idea. So I'm going to let him, I'm going to let him tell that origin story.
Well, I interviewed Nancy for another project I was working on, where she was being honored as an agent of change here in Seattle. And she and I just hit it off as friends. And we started hanging out and having lunch and talking about books a lot. And I had this vague idea for a book called The Writer's Library, which I thought of as a coffee table book in my mind, that go to writers' homes, take pictures of their libraries, and talk to them about the books in their libraries. And after getting to know Nancy for quite a while and feeling comfortable that she and I were close enough as friends that she could say no if she wanted to, but that I felt it would work, I asked her if she would be willing to work on this book with me. And she said she wasn't interested in doing a coffee table book, but that if it was a book of interviews, she would be interested. And she had an agent from her novel, George and Lizzie, who she had worked with. And we talked to her agent, and I'll let Nancy take over from that point.
So my agent, whose name is Victoria Sanders, said, not a coffee table book. She said, that's, not your brand. And she said, but a book of interviews would be absolutely great. Why don't you do 10 sample interviews, and then I could take it out to try to sell it. And I said, well, 10 interviews, like, no, we're not going to do 10 interviews. That's ridiculous. I said, we'll do 3 interviews. And so we wanted to, really give an idea of the range and the depth of the writers that we hope to include in the book. So the 3 interviews that we did to begin with were Jonathan Lethem, who happened to be who happened to be in Seattle to promote his new book at that time, The Feral Detective. And we interviewed him in his hotel room, and that interview lasted about 2 hours. And I think that we could have gone on even much longer than that, but he had to go to Elliott Bay to flog the book, basically. And then we interviewed a local Seattle writer, Charles Johnson, who won the National Book Award for Middle Passage, just an amazing, amazing novel. And then we interviewed Laurie Frankel, another Seattle writer who writes very character-driven novels with just great stories. And those 3, I think, gave an idea of the depth and the range of the interviews. And then we sold the book, and then Jeff and I had to decide who we were going to interview, and that was the hardest thing, one of the hardest things.
Well, we had to decide who we weren't going to interview was the really hard part,
right.
Because there were so many people that we would have loved to have interviewed. So, we had to narrow it down to a book-sized list of people that we would interview. Yeah.
Well, I would imagine, if everybody watching buys 5 copies tonight, we might be able to have a sequel on our hands at some point. So there's more material.
Absolutely.
So, what's interesting is there are 22 writers here. It's split right down the middle, male and female writers. I'm sure that was intentional, but how did you go about kind of building in kind of the equity that's kind of seen throughout the book? Like you said, figuring out who wasn't involved, but you have a really nice wide variety. You have, Native American writers like Louise Erdrich. You have, writers from, Vietnam. You have a pretty big swath of perspectives here. How did that all kind of come to play?
Well, a lot of that was intentional, well, it was all intentional. I think we wanted to look at the world of contemporary writers, of American writers, in using as broad a lens as possible. And I think that it was very important for us to have a list of an equal number of women and an equal number of men, and to include writers who had come to America from other countries or had become Americans as adults as well as children, as Maza Mengistu and Viet Thanh Nguyen did. And then we have that wonderful Louise Erdrich, who grew up, who was born in Tijuana and whose father was Mexican, mother was American. And the story that he told us was that they fought with each other to make Louise either Hispanic, either Mexican or American. And the way they fought was over the books that he read. It's just a really wonderful, wonderful, very moving account. So I think it was all deliberate. We knew as we were making the lists that there were people that we weren't going to be able to include because, because I said no more white men over 50 at one point. I remember that. So it didn't ever come to, fisticuffs, and we never yelled at each other, but, we were firm, weren't we, Jeff, about it?
We were, yeah. And, I like to look at the book as the melting pot of America. Initially, we talked about doing people from other countries as well, but we ultimately decided that we would try to look at America as it is today, at this sort of fraught moment in American history when immigration is such a compelling issue for so many people. We wanted to include as many different cultures as we could, and the way that they represent portions of the American culture. And as you say, we did that. We have a writer, a Vietnamese American writer. We have a Korean American writer. We have a Native American writer, Mexican American. I mean, Louise Erdrich, as Nancy said, basically grew up straddling the border between Mexico and America. So ultimately, I like to think of the book as a picture of the intellectual American melting pot.
It's funny. There are so few people in I guess in any kind of spotlight now that retain any level of mystery in the world. And it's kind of post-internet, everything we know too much about everybody, whether that's an actor or a writer or anybody. One of the people who has maintained that is Donna Tartt. Donna Tartt is like a mystery to me. And it's funny, I think, that she's the one person in the book that you ended up doing an email interview with, and you couldn't quite pin her down to do something in person. That just seems very on brand to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jeff and I both wanted very badly to include Donna Tartt in the book. And I had been lucky enough to have breakfast with her at an American Library Association conference, and at that breakfast we talked about books. So I knew both in person and from her 3 novels that she was really a reader, and she had really strong ideas about who was important and what she loved. And so, yeah, that was really important. I think we went back and forth about whether to do it via email, because that was not what we wanted to do. But in the end, we felt that including Donna Tartt would be a good thing. And I think we should, I think, you know, these interviews, there was a lot of laughter in these interviews. It was really sitting, you know, we sat around with these authors for, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours talking to them. We didn't have a list of questions that we wanted to ask each author. It wasn't kind of a set interview that way. And most of them started with me saying something like, did you grow up in a reading family, or were you a reader as a kid? But then after that, we let the writers take us wherever they wanted to go. And from Tom Boyle to Louise again, or Laurie Frankel, it was just so comfortable and just so much laughter, which I think does come through in the printed interviews.
Yeah, Donna Tartt is an interesting jumping off point to go into another area, which is when you see some writers and they kind of talk about their influence, you can very easily say, yeah, that makes sense. She's one where you go, you're not surprised that she loves Charles Dickens. It's not a surprise that she loves those kind of big multi-character magnum opus Victorian and all that stuff. But some of the others, you're like, whoa, this is nothing like what I would expect. And I was wondering, it's kind of like a chef, right? A chef at a fine dining restaurant. Oftentimes their favorite thing is like Popeye's chicken or something like that. They don't want anything to do with the kind of fancy 5-star thing. And a lot of these writers, they love to kind of dwell in the genre world and talk about some of the kind of juxtapositions you saw.
Jeff, do you want to start?
Gosh, sure. Well, I was surprised at how many writers love science fiction. It kind of amazed me, since we included only one writer who's really written science fiction novels, and that's Jonathan Lethem, who is not primarily known as a science fiction writer, but whose first few novels were much more sci-fi oriented. But it seemed like many of the writers loved science fiction. For example, Charles Johnson, an African-American writer who is older than many of the writers in the book, loved Philip K. Dick. And that, you know, that surprised me. But it turned out his mother loved science fiction. And he got those books from his mother. And I think in a way it makes sense, because science fiction is primarily written using the imagination, rather than a lot of fiction, which is sort of a synthesis of the world around us. Science fiction is all about imagining a world that's not around us. And people who become writers are people with very powerful imaginations usually. And I think that they tend to subvert that part of themselves when they become ambitious in a way to be seen as serious writers. They make a conscious decision to write about serious subjects. And so I think when you look at the fact that somebody like a Madeline Miller or a Charles Johnson loved science fiction when they were younger, it's an interesting window into them as a person, more so than into them as a writer. And I'll hand it off to Nancy from there.
Well, I think that Madeline Miller is somebody who, you know, the author of Circe and Song of Achilles, these great retellings of the Homeric novels, is somebody who was one of many authors that we interviewed, whose one of her favorite books still is Watership Down. And you know, I think I might have read Watership Down, but it certainly didn't make the kind of impression on me that it made on these authors. Michael Chabon read it to all of his kids, for example. But Madeline, in the interview, Madeline talked about how the last 100 pages of Watership Down is some of the most exciting writing that she had ever read. And this was during the time that she was studying Latin and Greek. You know, she was already so interested in those areas. So somehow all that came together for her, and in a way that does make a certain kind of sense.
Mm-hmm. One other genre fiction thing that really interested me was Louise Erdrich loved Western novels. And
that was a surprise.
Yeah, and she has like a collection of Louis L'Amour novels, and that came up because we asked her what she thought about the depiction of Native Americans in Western fiction, and it turned out that she was a fan of Western fiction. So, you know, you just you could really be surprised by what people love to read sometimes. At the same time, many people, you look at what they read, and it very much informed what they wrote.
I'd like to kind of drill down. You touched on something, Nancy, that I was always found interesting, which is how certain writers, Jeff, you kind of touched on this too, how certain writers kind of start from one place. And it almost seems like their ambition grows beyond their actual passions, and they kind of feel compelled to do something that's bigger or more literary. And I think the world, accepts genre more now than it used to. But I'll actually name someone as an example who's not in the book, but someone like Dennis Lehane, for example, who is such a naturally gifted, hard-boiled noir crime writer. But every kind of book after Mystic River, not every book, but kind of feels like it's just trying to up the ante and get bigger, and the world is bigger and it's more serious. And it kind of feels like you kind of just want to go, hey, let's get some more kind of hard-boiled crime. I see that in a lot of writers. Can you kind of speak to that, why that happens and why we see that?
I think it happens because writers, well, partly what you said, Jeff, the genre is just not as it's not seen as serious writing. You know, it's seen as, and that's why I hate that term genre. I hate the fact that we ghettoize genre as being lesser than literary fiction, that we shelve it in different places. You know, here are the mysteries, here's the Westerns, whatever. So it's not seen as, you're not taken seriously as a writer. You're not taken, your books, I mean, Dennis Lehane's mysteries, which I love with the two, the man and the I can't remember what their names are, but you know, they're on my bookshelves. You know, those are not going to be, they're not going to be nominated for the big awards. You know, they might win a mystery award and an Edgar or whatever, but they're not going to be seen as serious literature. And so I can see a writer feeling hemmed in by the genre conventions and wanting to break out and do something else. Remember that Charles Johnson, we were talking with Charles Johnson about the book on moral fiction because John Gardner was his advisor, his thesis advisor. And, you know, he says something about, I think that books should, that when you finish a book, you're a different person than you were when you read that book. And I'm not sure that, I suspect that's not something that happens with most what we call genre novels, although I could be wrong.
Well, I think I would look at two writers in particular to answer that question. One is Michael Chabon, who, not in our interview, but I think it might be in his introduction to the McSweeney's book he edited of sort of fantastic fiction. He talked about how when he was in grad school, it was made clear to him that he couldn't be writing genre fiction. And that's how he ended up writing The Mysteries of Pittsburgh, which is a very, straightforward, traditional first novel, along the lines of Goodbye Columbus or Catcher in the Rye. It's a young man comes of age, Bildungsroman kind of novel. And yet later in his career, he has sort of opened these doors towards genre fiction. He wrote a Sherlock Holmes novel. Yiddish Policeman's Union is an almost alternate universe novel that ended up winning a Hugo Award. Cavalier and Clay deals with comic books, the sort of lowest end of the literary art in the traditional sense. And he raised it to the highest form and won a Pulitzer Prize for it. So I think that, he's one writer who you can look at his career and see that trajectory. On the other hand, Jonathan Lethem started out by writing science fiction books. His first novel is Gun with Occasional Music, is actually a blend of science fiction and hard-boiled noir fiction. And I think Jonathan actually, I don't want to say this in a sort of condescending way, but he almost outgrew the conventions of genre fiction to the point where he intellectually wanted to deal with issues that were bigger than he could fit into the framework of a traditional genre novel. And so he ended up writing novels that were not traditional genre novels. Now he's gone back, and with The Feral Detective, for example, he wrote what's a hard-boiled novel to a certain degree, but is also a very topical literary novel. And I think, but he had to kind of break out of the genre thing to sort of, stretch his wings, or whatever that cliche is, to fly, basically. And then he's kind of been able to come back to it and combine those things. And his new novel is a almost science fiction novel that is really fascinating for this time, because it's set in a world in which power fails, all electronic devices fail, and we're very isolated. It's called The Arrest. I think it comes out next month. It's a wonderful novel for this time.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Nancy.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think the same thing is true with humorous fiction. I mean, I think humorous fiction is really hard to write in any case, because we all have our different ideas of what's funny. But I know that Andrew Sean Greer's newest novel, Less, is probably the only Pulitzer Prize winning novel that is funny. And I mean, and I was the chair of the fiction jury that selected those finalists for the Pulitzer, and we knew that we were taking a chance, because it typically a funny novel is not what you think of as, you think of a big novel as an award-winning, especially a Pulitzer.
But again, he had that novel, Story of a Marriage, which was so dark and serious. And then, comes back with Less, which is such a charming and funny novel. It is interesting how people can kind of snap back into, how they can stretch out and then snap back into what is maybe comes more naturally to them, or what they truly love.
Well, it's interesting because you see, if you look at a writer and they have a long enough career, it does seem like, and this is true, I think, of musicians and any artist really, they might have an early part and then they kind of have their later part, but there's this kind of Venn diagram moment that happens somewhere where a book or an album or whatever that would be kind of hits all the notes of like the best parts of both periods. I would argue someone like Jonathan Lethem, for example, like The Fortress of Solitude for me is the book that kind of was the one that straddled the line there. And a lot of people have that, like Philip Roth, for example. Somebody brought up, I guess you were saying something about Goodbye Columbus. That American pastoral period was kind of like that period for him, where it kind of merged these like later and the earlier, and kind of came to a place. If, and we'll kind of, it's a little bit of a tangent, but you talk to these writers, I'm curious, do you think that the writers have an awareness of where they are in their own career in terms of like their arc?
Ooh, good
Great
question.
question.
Yeah.
I think some of them do, and some of them don't, probably. Certainly, some of them are someone like Russell Banks is aware that he is at the tail end of his arc, and he talked about now he's rereading Tolstoy, and he's gotten to this point where he won't read new works. It just he's reached the point where he wants to revisit all the things that he loved as he's doing a kind of summing up. I think for many writers, it's, as for many people, it's unclear to us where we are in our arc, where we are in the arc of our personal story. And that's probably a good thing.
Well, I think that Tom Boyle, that T.C. Boyle, is aware of where he is in the arc of his career, and is just really looking forward to all the rest of the books that he's going to write, and all the interests that he has that he can explore in those books. I mean, I think that was an entirely, that was an interview in which the future of American literature looked awfully bright, I thought.
It's a quick, funny T.C. Boyle story. I've had one of the things about reading this book, what was fun for me personally, was that I've had a chance to meet or know most of these writers over the years. And what's funny is I always end up asking them about what they're reading too, and I can actually recall some consistency in some of the things they answer here. And so that's nice to see that. These are the actual answers. But I was always nervous to meet T.C. Boyle because he's such kind of a character, and he's got to be 6'7". I don't know. He's super tall. He's an imposing character, and his mind to me was imposing. And so I met him, and I'd been a fan of his for a long time, and I was a little bit nervous. And we were talking, and he had a new book out at that time about Frank Lloyd Wright. And we'll get into the fact that he lives in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, but he had a book out about Frank Lloyd Wright. And we were just in my car, and he asked me what my favorite thing of his was, which I thought was kind of interesting. And I told him I loved his short stories, especially his big collection of short stories. And in that collection was a story called The Lie, which is a story he wrote about a guy who just decides one day to not go to work and tells a lie that just, the whole day becomes worse and worse because of the ramifications of this one lie. So I told him that. And so the event was that night, and he was going to read from this Frank Lloyd Wright book. Well, he got there, and unbeknownst to me, he had gone home to his hotel and had the front desk print off a copy of this story and he just read that story. He didn't even read from his book, and it was such a sweet, nice thing to do. And it kind of totally took the edge off of how nervous I was about meeting this kind of crazy character that he is. But that to that point, what do you bring into these interviews in terms of like what to expect and what the setting is like? Because going into someone's home is very different than being on the phone or doing an email or even being in a neutral setting. Were you nervous? Were you daunted? What was the feeling like?
Well, I think Jeff and I had both interviewed separately years ago, T.C. Boyle, and I'm like 5 feet tall. And so T.C. Boyle is really tall, and he always wears red high top, like Converse. I think they're Converse. And so, and I remember when I was supposed to interview him, it was when Seattle had a book festival. And when the schedule was announced, people would come up to me and they would say, "You're interviewing T.C. Boyle," and then they would shake their heads, and I was just like terrified. And so when we went to T.C. Boyle's house, which is the first prairie style Frank Lloyd Wright home west of the Mississippi, I believe, you're supposed to ring a bell, and then the gate, will open. And so Jeff and I actually stood there for about 5 minutes arguing, we're 3 and 4 years old, about who's going to ring the bell. And I would, Jeff would say, you ring it, he'll know who you are. And I'd say, no, Jeff, you ring it. And so there we are arguing, and then the gate opens and he comes out. And, so we still don't
never
know.
rang the bell.
Right, we never rang the bell, yeah. Yes.
Well,
So
the thing about these interviews, to begin with, is that Nancy is, despite her demurrals, Nancy is a famous person, and most of these writers are very familiar with Nancy. So that gave us a great advantage, I felt, going into all of these interviews, that that I never felt as a journalist when I would interview people. You know, I always felt intimidated by them because they were who I wanted to be. They were famous writers. And but when I was with Nancy, I felt like I had this shield. And so when we went to T.C. Boyle's house, you know, I'm like, well, you're famous. You're America's librarian. You ring the bell. I don't have an action figure.
Yeah, T.C. Boyle doesn't have an action figure either, just to point that out. So there you
That's
go.
true. But honestly, he's the nicest guy in the world. I mean, I'm happy. I mean, the first time I interviewed him, he was incredibly nice. And a year later, a friend of mine interviewed him and had him sign his new book to me. And he wrote some nice note to me saying, you know, indicating that he remembered our interview and let's do it again sometime. And you know,
and when we emailed him originally to ask him if he would, you know, agree to if he would let us interview him. And I think we should say how grateful we are to those 23 writers for giving us that time out of their lives and letting us, you know, spend an hour or so, more than an hour with them. T.C. Boyle wrote back and said, "What fun we will have." And, you know, that seemed to be the tagline as Jeff and I went through getting lost in the Northeast because Waze and Google Maps and, you know, failed us. We couldn't find where we were going and there was a thunder. Remember, Jeff?
Oh, I remember.
Yeah, he's somebody that you definitely want to go on a road trip with. A road trip with T.C. Boyle would be something I would sign up for.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, a road trip with Nancy Pearl is pretty good too.
Oh, stop.
We had a really good time, and you know, we were close friends going into it, and we were close friends coming out of it, and that was really the most important thing. Was that the only reason I was at all hesitant to broach this project with Nancy originally was just fear that it might hurt our friendship somehow, and it didn't at all. So that was great. But yeah, what fun we will have. I think we did have a lot of fun. And
yes, we did.
We went to a lot of places that were both, I mean, me much more than Nancy, because Nancy speaks at libraries all over the country and the world, really. I'm a homebody. And I think Nancy is naturally a homebody, and she kind of pries herself out of her home by doing these things. But now, you know, inertia would keep us both at home, I think. So this was, what fun we had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask a couple of questions. So Nancy, we have a viewer who says, you know, you mentioned that Less was kind of maybe the rare comedy or comic novel that won a Pulitzer. They said, what about Confederacy of Dunces, which is quite funny and won the Pulitzer Prize?
Yeah.
Now the story behind it getting published and winning the Pulitzer is anything but funny, but but they're probably
that's about right. Every 30 years, maybe a funny novel will win a Pulitzer.
40 years, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's true. That's a very great book. So Cindy, one of our viewers, Cindy, says, did any writer that you interviewed motivate you to read an author or book that you had not read yet? You know, what did you encounter anything that was totally new to you in this journey?
Well, I came home determined to either read or reread Watership Down. And I'm happy to say there's a beautiful new edition, or just a very nice trade paperback edition. I hope you have at the store, because I hope people will read it.
I'll tell you a book, sorry, go ahead. No, a book that I was not familiar with, that in the very first interview came up with Jonathan Lethem. And I think Nancy brought it up, and Jonathan concurred that it was this great LA novel, The Nowhere City by Alison Lurie. And I grew up in LA. So I was very excited to read that, and it is a great LA novel. I don't even know if it's in print. But anyone out there who enjoys LA fiction, The Nowhere City by Alison Lurie, fantastic book. And there were, you know, throughout these interviews, I learned about books that I had not known about, and they're on my to be read list now. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that we've heard consistently from readers of the book, is how the book has given them so many ideas about what to read. And that's what we wanted. We want to encourage people to discover new writers and to read joyously.
Did you encounter any of these writers that have embraced e-reading? I'm just curious if any of them have kind of gone in that direction.
Well, Viet Thanh Nguyen reads both on his e-reader and in traditional print and paper, but he listens
And
to
audio.
all three. He does audiobooks as well. And it mostly for him depends on the book. I mean, he said when he's doing research, he likes to read on his Kindle so he can underline and then find the material later. But other than that, I don't know that we really got into those that
I think we asked. I feel like people answered, but the answers were not especially
right.
Insightful or interesting. I mean, like people would say, I like an e-reader for reading on airplanes, you know? I mean, it's the same thing that anyone would say. Their writers ultimately aren't different in that regard. I mean, some of them, I'm a collector of books, and some of them are collectors. And Viet actually talked about how every famous writer that he meets, he tries to get them to sign a first edition of one of their books. Jonathan Lethem is a prodigious collector, although an eccentric collector. He has his writers who he likes to collect. He doesn't feel the need to collect all of Philip Roth's books because he doesn't feel they're going to vanish from the face of the earth. But a writer, Don Carpenter, is a writer. Hard Rain Falling, I think, is his most famous book. But he wants to have all of Don Carpenter's books. He wanted all of Thomas Berger's books, who wrote Little Big Man. And he actually ended up befriending Thomas Berger and becoming Thomas Berger's literary executor. But, you know, Thomas Berger is a writer who, well, you would know better than we would, Jeff, but are his books in print these days?
I feel like I feel for some reason like I've seen a recently issued version of Little Big Man in the last, I just feel like it's something I've seen, but he's someone who I think was widely.
I mean, the guy wrote, you know, 30 novels, and I don't know if anything else is in print.
You know, he's like a Richard Brodigan or something that's like was big and it's very difficult to find now. But that's a good point. We have a question from Lisa, one of our viewers, that I would put to both of you. And I think you can probably try to boil it down to one or two things. But if the tables had been turned and you both were interviewed for this same book, what are a couple of the books that would be on your essential list that kind of defined you two? Maybe Jeff, you want to start?
Sure. Philip Roth is my favorite American, or my favorite writer is Philip Roth. And I would certainly never want to be on a desert island without a Philip Roth book. I'd have a hard time choosing which one because he wrote so many great books. I guess if I had to choose, I might choose Letting Go because it is long and I love it. And it's maybe his least fashionable book, and he was not fond of it later in his life. It was his first actual full-length novel, and it's Henry Jamesian. The two novels that, or the novel and the short story collection that I adapted for the stage, I adapted The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chavon and Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson. And those two books are as important to me and as dear to me as any books, and were before I adapted them. And then I would have to choose an Alice Munro collection. I believe she's the greatest writer of short stories since Chekhov. And she's a master of compression and the telling detail, and yet brings such a breadth to each of her stories that there is powerful as novels.
And we did want to interview Alice Munro very badly. She was on both of our lists, but she was ill. Well, she's quite elderly now and wasn't doing any
I think
interviews.
she may technically be retired from what I've heard. I'm not totally
Right.
sure if that's true or
Yeah.
not, but that's a great list. Nancy, what's on your list?
So I think one of the books that's on my list was on T.C. Boyle's bookshelf and Viet Thanh Nguyen's bookshelf, and it's The Woman Who Lost Her Soul by Bob Shakocious. And it was a finalist for the Pulitzer the year it was published, but very few people that I've known have read it. And I do think it's one of the great, I think it's just a great novel. And the other one is Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove, which I think is a novel that won the Pulitzer Prize. So you could say a Western won the novel, but as these reviews always say, oh no, that book transcended its genre, which is a phrase that makes me nauseous. But I think that Lonesome Dove is one of those books that almost anyone who loves to read would enjoy that book because it has so many entry points into it. You know, it's a book where the setting is so vividly described. Those two characters you will never forget. The plot is great. So those are two books. And Jeff, I'm surprised that after seeing that book and after my talking about it, that you didn't say that you wanted to read The Woman Who Lost Her Soul.
Well, I would like to read it, but it's a very long book, so I have to steel myself to do it. I'm actually in the middle now of The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell, which is a very long 630-page book, and I'm a slow reader.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my feelings are seriously hurt. I doubt we'll do another book together. Yeah.
unless we include Bob Shakocious. And have you given me a copy of that book, Nancy?
Put in the contract for the sequel. That has to be in the contract.
Right.
The writer.
Have you read it, Jeff? Jeff Martin?
I have not read it. I have not read it.
So now we're both on her list.
I promise to read it. I promise to read it.
Me too.
So honestly, I'd never even heard of it before seeing this book, to be honest with you.
Yeah, yeah, that's the problem. Yeah, that's sad.
So to the point you make about that book, though, talk about some of the overlap that you saw and some of the books that appeared and were kind of crossing over some of the different writers. What were some of the things that kept popping up?
Well, interestingly, on moral fiction, John Gardner's book popped up both with Charles Johnson and with Richard Ford, both of whom had known him and had great respect for him. So I thought that was very, very interesting. Two of the writers had first editions of The Great Gatsby.
That's right.
Laurie Frankel and Jonathan Lethem.
And it's also Susan Choi's favorite book ever.
And it's also Susan Choi's favorite book. Right.
Laurie Moore is perhaps the most recommended author in the book, and we very, very much wanted to interview Laurie Moore for this book. We had an email correspondence with her in which she told us she did not want to do the interview, and she wouldn't do the interview in person, but she would do it by email. And at that time, we were holding out for all in-person interviews. And in the end, we did do Donna Tartt by email, but it was literally the last interview we did for the book. And if we could at that point have gone back and done Laurie Moore by email, we would have. And then we talked about, we've certainly talked about that we will do Laurie Moore by email if we do another book. She'll be, if we do another book, she'll be the one email interview that we agree to do.
She's the Donna Tartt of the sequel.
Yeah. Right.
That's right, absolutely. But yeah, she's the most recommended writer in the book, I would say.
Yeah.
Nancy, I'm curious what you think about this. We've seen, you mentioned The Great Gatsby, which makes me think about this. There's a new book coming out called Nick, which is The Great Gatsby from a different perspective. And this is something we've seen a lot over the last, I would say, decade plus really, and it's happened before, but basically retellings of classic novels through minor characters. I mean, I guess this goes back to like Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. It's not a new thing, but it seems to be happening more. What do you think about that generally, about kind of taking this intellectual property, I guess, for lack of a better word, and basically reusing it or retelling it?
I think that it depends on who the writer is, who the appropriating writer is, and how well they handle it. There's a wonderful novel called Vanessa and Her Sister by Priya Parmar, which takes the story, it takes Virginia Woolf and her sister Vanessa Bell, and using Vanessa's journals actually came up with this wonderful, wonderful novel. So I totally approve of Priya Parmar appropriating their lives. But I think in some ways it's a real tribute to the original book. I mean, I think that what makes me sad about it is that I would like people to go back to Jane Austen and not just read all the adaptations, you know, the sort of modern takes on Jane Austen. I guess it depends on how well the writer does it. I don't think I have a strong position to defend on that.
Well, and the great master of that at the moment is Madeline Miller, who's interviewed in our book, whose Circe and Song of Achilles are wonderful retellings of Homer's tales, and who's currently working on a retelling of The Tempest by Shakespeare. And I couldn't be more excited about a book than that. And there was a great series done a few years ago in which contemporary novelists retold the Shakespearean canon. And I read a few of those. Ann Tyler did one, Vinegar Girl, based on
Margaret Atwood, I believe, did one.
Yeah.
And Howard Jacobson did Merchant of Venice. And that was another great one. Nick, of course, is being done now because Great Gatsby is going into the public domain next year. And up until now, it has not been able to be done. So that's exciting.
I will say that, you know, just as a plug for another book I really loved, I just read a book called Black Bottom Saints by Alice Randall. And, you know, she did The Wind Done Gone, the kind of retelling of Gone with the Wind, and which I thought was also quite interesting and kind of ahead of its time, I guess, in a way. So we've got a few minutes left. I wanted to touch on a couple more things before we wrap up. What do you feel is because basically I would say, you know, you're kind of focusing mostly on quote unquote literary figures here. What do you feel, and take the temperature on where literary fiction stands in the culture right now? Is it in a good place? Is it thriving? Is it, you know, how do you feel in 2020? Novels and particularly fiction. I don't think nonfiction has any problem right now at all, but you know, it seems like fiction comes in waves and there's moments for it. Nancy, you might be a good person to start with. What do you think about the world we are in right now?
I think literary fiction, I don't want anybody to write a book about the pandemic anytime soon. I mean, I would like that to you know, let it percolate a little bit and, you know, and come to some resolution before novelists take that on. But I really think that there are some wonderful novelists out there, that literary fiction, I think, is in really, I'm kind of hopeful about it. I think that some of the Russell Banks is 79. You know, he has a new novel coming out, but he told us that he's thinking, or his wife would really like him to stick to short stories. But I think there are new writers. I'm not a fan of autobiographical fiction, whatever it's called, autofiction or something. I hate it, actually, but to be honest. But I think that there are writers who are going to continue to help us see the world through eyes that are not our own. And I think that's really a really valuable thing.
Same question for you, Jeff. I guess, where, as a reader, as a book collector, as someone who adapts, novels and short stories to the stage, do you feel like there's the same wealth of material as there's always been? Do you have any doubt of the future of fictional tales?
I think fiction's really thriving right now. I think there's been a huge injection of energy into it from the multicultural conversation that the country is having right now. That's brought in a lot of younger writers who are adding value to it. And I also think that in a strange way, the pandemic has given people more time and space to read. And I think that people are, maybe it's the world I'm living in, and it's my small little bubble, but people seem to be reading a lot and talking more about what they're reading. And I think that's wonderful. And also, you have to give credit where it's due. I think Oprah Winfrey, I think Reese Witherspoon, these famous people who are using their platforms to talk about literary fiction are doing the world a service. They're prying people's eyes away from TV and from the Kardashians and getting them to look at things that hopefully are enriching everyone's lives more.
Yeah.
I know that Laurie Frankel, whose book was chosen by Reese Witherspoon's book club, was very grateful and excited when that happened. And it brings a lot of welcome recognition and also a lot of financial relief to allow a writer to write when somebody like that offers them a platform.
That's so true. We did an event a year or so ago, or God, who knows how long, because time is so weird right now. But we did an event for Where the Crawdads Sing, and that's such an amazing story of how it came to be and the writer and all these different things. But the coolest thing about it to me was we live in such a segmented culture now. There's very few times when we can really ever talk about the same thing. This kind of monoculture that we at one time had doesn't really exist anymore.
Well, I'll just pick up that point by saying that Nancy, Nancy, of course, founded the program If All Seattle read the same book here in Seattle, and really helped create programs like that around the country, which brought the culture together. At that time, she did it with The Sweet Hereafter by the great Russell Banks, and really helped center the culture on a common conversation. I was relatively new to Seattle at that time, and I had already read The Sweet Hereafter, but I remember feeling grateful and excited about that at the time, that Seattle was focused on something literary. That was great. Yeah. Good work, Nancy.
My last question is this, and we'll wrap up, is if for those people who are watching, if they are to, after they pick up a copy of this book, of course, which you can do by clicking the link in the chat there, if they're going to start with one book by one of the writers in here, what book would they start with? Pick one of the books by any of the 23 writers here and tell them that's the one.
Oh, that's so unkind to the other 22 to begin with. But I'm going to jump right in.
They're not watching. They're not watching this. Don't worry.
Let's hope not. I'm going to jump right in with an answer, because Nancy had said to me that the one book she would always recommend to people if she was going to pick one book was Lonesome Dove, because there were so many different ways into the book. So whatever you like about fiction, Lonesome Dove has it. And I think another book to me that's very much like that I would recommend is Amor Towles' A Gentleman in Moscow, which is a book that is enchanting, charming. It has depth. It is beautifully written. It has wonderful characters. You really cannot go wrong with that book.
And that's one of those books that hits the monoculture, right? It became a thing. It had a moment, and that's a really special thing for everybody to be reading that book at one time. Is a really special moment.
Yeah.
And what an enchanting man he is.
Right.
Just, you know, we got to spend time sitting in his book-lined den, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and he's on the board of Library of America. And, you know, so we were talking about one of our favorite writers, John O'Hara, and he said, well, you know, of course, we publish him at Library of America, so I hope his work survives. And
yeah, love John O'Hara. I just watched Butterfield 8. I hadn't seen it in a while, the movie.
Love that movie. Love it.
So Nancy, final question, that same one to you. Is, you know, if you had to recommend one book for one of these writers.
God, that is okay. I'm going to say Circe, Madeline Miller's Circe. I think that's another book that that has such funny moments and yet is such an interesting, serious look at a femininity and the, you know, a feminine, and it shows Madeline's sort of feminist outlook, which you certainly see in the interview that we did with her.
Yeah. Well, I think by my tally, for those of you watching at home, the writers it's Russell Banks and it's Madeline Miller, and Jonathan Lethem got the most mentions of any writer tonight. So that means something. So I want to say a huge thank you to Jeff and Nancy for joining us and for putting this collection together. It really was a real pleasure, and I'll be dipping back into it a lot to find my next things to read. So thank you for doing that. And thank you all for joining. Make sure to get a copy of this book for yourself, for your friends, for gifts. The holidays somehow are just around the corner, so make sure to do that. It's a wonderful gift for the readers in your life. And take care of yourself, and we will see you all very, very soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having us, Jeff.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.